Hi there. Thanks for joining me. I'm Jean Farish, and I'm working today from my home in North Carolina. And hold that thought. Yes, this is me, and right now I'm doing a voiceover after freezing the frame because I was not able to make a episode this week. I had some fairly minor dental surgery. My face is swollen and it's bruised and it's kind of hard to talk. So rather than not have any kind of a new episode this week, I instead have gone back and pulled out several segments and cobbled them all together to bring you this new episode this week. So enjoy. So, what I want to talk about now are the three basic methods for doing cross stitch because I keep seeing posts in various groups about people saying what is the correct way to do a cross stitch. And there is no one correct way. There are three basic ways that I'm going to talk about right now. And I've mentioned two of the three already in previous episodes. But even when I categorize these three, there are, I should say infinite. I haven't stopped and figured out. Maybe some of you that are mathematically inclined can stop and figure out how many different ways are there to make an X. But so much of it depends on what I am stitching. If I'm stitching letters like I was in this past week doing the Next Hearts Come Home at Christmas lesson, when I'm stitching letters, I basically stitch them as if I'm writing the letter. And so whether I start at the bottom or the top, all depends on where I am with that letter. The only critical thing I would say in terms of best practices is to always make sure that the slant of your top stitch is consistent throughout the piece. So whichever way it's leaning or slanting, make sure that all the top stitches are slanting that way throughout the piece. And that's the only thing I would say that really matters. Of course, the number one thing that matters is that you're enjoying stitching the project. So let's talk about the Danish method, the English method, and the Victorian method. And although I have demonstrated the Victorian method before, I am going to demonstrate that as well right now too. Okay, so we're going to start with the Danish method, which most people think of when they think of regular cross stitch. When you're doing the Danish method, you're basically doing a row of half cross stitches, working from left to right, and each stitch is going from the bottom to the top. Here, let me do it poke and pull so that's a little more clear. So I'm going from the bottom to the top. If I were stitching an Aida, I'd be stitching each half cross in one square. On linen, I'm doing it over 2 linen threads. And then when I've done whatever number of stitches are required by the design, I then finish the cross stitch by going back in the other direction. And this is what, again, people refer to as being, regular cross stitch. And it is actually, when you're stitching like this, you're stitching in what needleworkers think of as being the Danish method. And whether you're poking and pulling or whether you're stitching in the sewing method like this, it's still the same stitch. And on the back, what you see are upright stitches like this. And this is why so many people think of cross stitch. They think on the back, all your stitches need to go up and down. And that's kind of where this comes from. And that would be true if you're doing the whole thing in the Danish method. You're not ever going to have every stitch going straight up and down in the back. You're going to have places where you are doing a series of stitches and then you're going out by one or in by one, and that's going to give you a little bit of a different look on the back. So I would just encourage you not to obsess with that all your stitches on the back have to be straight up and down. That's a myth that I would be very happy to put that one to rest. So that's the Danish method. Let's take a look at what we refer to as the English method. I've started a second row here, and as you can see, there's no difference in the way these stitches look. The difference is the way they're executed. I'm going to start at the top and work to the bottom for my first leg, and then complete that stitch, again working top to bottom. Now if I were working on Aida, I'd be stitching each square like this, and of course on linen I'm coming over 2 threads and stitching like this. The English method has a lot of advantages. It's ideal when you are working with variegated floss or any kind of an over-dyed floss. But one of the advantages that many people find is that if you make a mistake, and we all do, when you make a mistake, it's a lot easier to rip out and replace stitches when you have complete stitches like this. So I'm just going to do 2 more here, and then let's take a look at what it looks like on the back. So again, I hope that you see that there's not a strong indication by looking at the front as far as which method has been used. So this again is what we have on the back. Again, Danish and English. Both of them are perfectly good ways to do cross stitch. Now the Victorian method is one that I particularly like, but I find I like it best when I'm doing a single row as opposed to a block of color. You're doing complete stitches. This one, you're always going to be working from the right to the left. And I like it because it's a very easy one for sewing. In fact, I find it I have to really concentrate if I don't do it as a sewing method. Let me demonstrate it that way though. So my first half cross is going from bottom to top, and my second half cross to complete it is going from top to bottom. And then I'm moving over again on Aida. It would be 1 square, stitching on linen over 2. I'm coming over 2 threads. I think I'm going to run out of thread before I get to the end of this to make 3 rows that are all the same length. But I think with 1 more stitch I can show you on the back again how different it looks. So whether you're doing Danish or English or Victorian, they're all cross stitches and they're all great stitches to use, and they're great tools to have in your tool belt. The reason I wanted to show all 3 of them together is for once and for all, hopefully, to put to rest the idea that there is one way to do a cross stitch. As you saw, sometimes you start top to bottom, sometimes you go bottom to top, and sometimes it's a combination of the two. So all three of them are legitimate ways of doing a cross stitch, and all of them have a kind of all of them can be put to use in different situations and different projects. So if nothing else, what I'd love to do is just dispel the whole idea that there's one way to do a cross stitch, because that just isn't true. And hopefully you will find that all three methods work for you in one situation or another. So enjoy. Another great question that I got was from Jacinta. I hope I'm saying your name right. And she asked whether or not cross-stitch fabrics have a right and wrong side, and whether or not they have an up and a down. And the other part of that unasked question is, do they have a up and down compared to sideways? And so I want to talk about all of that a little bit here and talk about linen in general. And what I'm about to talk about in these next few minutes are all about linen. Linen is an even weave. I just want to be really clear about that. Modern day stitchers, and I want to say that this has happened more like in the last 10 or 20 years than say 30 or 40 years ago when I started my company. Somehow people have categorized that there's a category of linen and there's a category of even weave. And that is just not true. Linen is an even weave. It is woven evenly. The same number of threads are going across as going up and down. In other words, in weaving terms, the warp and the weft are the same. The same number of threads are making up each of those two directions. And that's what defines even weave. Linen, to be called linen, has to be made from 100% flax. And flax is a plant. It is grown to be used in fiber production, to be making cloth and other things, just as cotton is a plant and is grown to make fabric and other things as well. So that is the distinction between linen and even weave. Even weave is a fabric made of something other than flax. So I'll get off my soapbox now and talk about the specifics. To use another weaving term, the linen that we use for counted thread work is a plain weave. It is woven so you're over, under, over, under, over, under a thread. There are other types of weaves. For example, the denim that our blue jeans are made out of is a twill. So it's might be over 2 and under 1, over 2 and under 1. And then the next row is offset. So that's getting into a whole lot of weaving terms. But I just want to be clear that the linen and even weaves that we stitch with are also what we call plain weaves. And that's what makes them so beautiful for doing counted thread work. With that in mind, there is a difference between the up and down and the sideways. To a weaver, there's a huge difference. To a needle worker, I want to say not so much. Unless your fabric comes to you with the selvage still intact, you don't know which is the top and which is the side. There's no way of telling. So don't make yourself crazy about that. If you do have a piece and it has the selvage attached to it, then the selvage is the sides. That's the long way. However, if what you want to stitch for that particular piece of fabric fits, if you turn it 90 degrees, that's okay. Again, my opinion. And I want to tell you, I am not a textile expert by any stretch of the imagination. And I hope that there are not textile experts out there pulling their hair out, because that would be unfortunate. But in my experience of 40 years of stitching professionally, I don't see a difference. I also don't see a difference from the front or back of a traditional piece of linen or even weave. Now, if it's printed or if it's an over-dyed, then yes, you might see a difference between the front and the back. But it's not like, you know, if you're a home sewer, if you took home ec like I did back in the 50s and 60s and whenever they stopped teaching home ec, I don't know. But if you do a lot of home sewing, then you know most fabric comes to you off of a bolt with a front and a back. That is not the case with your traditional cross-stitch fabric. So what I'm about to share with you is what I do when I know that my threads are color fast, how I wash them and iron them. So let's go upstairs. Let's see how this is going to work out, because I've got the camera in one hand and I'm trying to do the washing and ironing with the other hand. So this is really a voiceover, a narration after the fact. So I just put my finger in a jar of Orvis soap, and it really only takes a drop. So that's why I just stick my finger in there, and that's a gracious plenty for what I need to do just for this little basin. I started with warm water because I feel like it helps the soap get activated better. And then I immediately switched to cold water, so I end up with a tepid temperature. Now, as I'm washing it, all I'm doing is swishing it around. I am doing my best not to add any wrinkles to it. So when I go to rinse it, I'm going to not wring it at all. In just a minute, you're going to notice that I find a needle in the bottom of my basin. So I would suggest that before you start, that one of the first things to do is check and make sure you don't have any needles in your work. I feel very fortunate that I found that one, because it certainly would have caused a problem with the garbage disposal. So I'm now rinsing it under cool water. And again, I'm not wringing it at all, because I don't want to add any, here's that needle, I don't want to add any wrinkles to the work. Now, before I started, I laid a small towel out on the counter, and I'm just going to pick this up dripping wet and lay it right on the towel. And again, understand I'm doing this one-handed, so it's a little awkward. But I'm just going to lay it out flat on the towel. Make sure I'm not adding any wrinkles, because what I'm going to do now is to roll it up in this towel. And I'm basically doing this so that I won't be dripping water across the kitchen floor as I take this over to the ironing board. Before I started the washing process, I had my ironing board set up with a layer of 4 terry towels. Basically, it's 2 terry towels that are each folded in half, so I have 4 layers. I have used as many as 6 layers at a time, and I recommend anywhere between that 4 and 6 number to make sure you have a really nice thick cushion between your piece and the hard surface of the ironing board. I also set my iron's temperature to the linen setting, because I am stitching on linen. Now, if you're stitching on one of the even weave fabrics, then you need to make sure that you're not setting your iron too high, because your man-made fibers are not going to take as warm a temperature as linen or 100% cotton would. Now you're seeing a little bit of steam, but my iron is actually set on the dry setting. You're seeing the steam because my hot iron is coming in contact with the wet fabric. So I wouldn't say it was dripping wet, but it was pretty wet, because all I did was loosely roll it up in that other smaller towel to carry it over to the ironing board. Notice that I am pretty much keeping my iron in constant motion. Do not let it rest for any length of time in one spot, or you're going to end up scorching it. You'll also notice I'm not using a pressing cloth. Now, my stitches are pretty tight, so I don't really see any need for a pressing cloth. But if I had loose stitches on the back, then I definitely would be using a pressing cloth. Also keep in mind that I stitched with 100% cotton floss. I did not use any metallics. I don't have any buttons or beads. So this is what I do when I have strictly cross stitch that's being that was stitched with 100% cotton floss. Once you feel like the piece is pretty much dry, then if you just carefully peel back the corner, the interesting thing is that you'll see an impression of your stitches on the towel. Now, unfortunately, trying to do this one-handed, I didn't get quite as distinct image as I have at other times. But you can usually actually see the sampler impressed on the terry towel. I gently moved the sampler so that I can now iron the other half of it and just continue following the same process. And I just keep ironing until I feel like it's pretty much dry. Once I do feel like it's dry, I'm going to hang it on a skirt hanger. By letting it air dry overnight, I prevent adding wrinkles to it when I either stitch it, or if I'm completely finished with the project and I'm ready to pin it or lace it to foam core, then I know I'm not going to be accidentally adding any wrinkles to the piece. Last week when we talked about figuring out what the count was of a fabric that you're planning to use, I used a sample where I already had the cross stitches done and simply measured them. But I do want to make the point that you don't have to do full cross stitches. In this case, if I were doing Aida, I would just go over a square, under a square, over a square. Since I was on linen here, I went over 2, under 2, over 2, under 2, from one point over on the horizontal and from that point down on the vertical. And then I simply took a ruler and measured from that point over and from that point down to see how many stitches I had in 1 inch. And in this case, it ended up being 15, which is what I expected. But it's always just a nice, it's a safety measure. Just, take the extra 10 or 15 minutes to do that so that you save yourself any heartache down the road. Here's the other half of Karen's question. She said, your very instructive video came at just the right time because I have a question about the shadow that remains when you undo stitching due to an error, etc. My situation is that I undid a dark thread on a light fabric and cannot erase all evidence of that former stitching. I tried various types of tape without success. Can you suggest a product or a technique that will erase all the thready evidence? Okay, this is something we have all faced, and it seems like that inevitably what we have to rip out is navy blue or black or a bright red. And yes, you will end up with evidence, as Karen calls it. So first of all, what is that evidence? Most likely it's microscopic thread fuzzies, just little bits of thread fibers that have been caught on the fabric. It's more likely probably to happen when you're stitching on linen because the fabric's a little bit coarser, but it can happen on any fabric. She took some good steps. I start with sticky tape, but remember, do it on both sides of the fabric. We tend to think of the front, but also do it on the back. And then the other thing would be to go over it gently with a new white eraser. Again, what my friends in the UK call a rubber. This is what I use. It's just a white eraser that comes in this fancy little box thing. And I don't use it for anything other than my needlework. And I find that sometimes going over with that will help. But the big thing though, and again, you know I am a strong proponent of washing my needlework. And I find it very often that this last little shadow, I can get rid of it by washing the piece. I think the thing that I try to teach throughout all of them is what I call stitch confidence. I want you to feel that you have the skill set to read a chart and read a stitch diagram and go for it. Don't ever apologize for being self-taught. So many people will send me messages and say, you know, I've never taken a class. I'm just self-taught. That's probably the best way to learn, is just to dive in. And when something catches your eye and you find yourself saying, I wonder how you do that, explore it, find out how to do it, and just practice. Don't feel like everything has to be a showpiece. It's fine to just have a doodle cloth and just keep practicing these various things as you come across them. So, you know, just develop your stitch confidence. That is the thing that I think is the most important thing that we needleworkers can do. But that does bring me to the end of today's video. And so once again, I will encourage you to stitch happy and stay safe.